Nurse Susan Carter thought it was just another late shift, until an elderly woman was abandoned at the hospital with no name, no past, and only a single brooch pinned to her coat. Curious, Susan inspects it, and her heart stops. She knows. This brooch. It belonged to her mother, the woman she believed dead for decades. But how? And why was she hidden from the world for so long? As Susan uncovers the truth, one shocking revelation changes everything. Want to know what happened? Watch until the end and don't miss this emotional, twist-filled story. Comment your city and subscribe for more. The hospital hallways were unusually quiet that night. The low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow on the polished floors. Nurse Susan Carter had just finished her rounds when a call crackled through the intercom. There's an elderly woman at the reception. No identification, no family, no explanation. Susan frowned. It wasn't unusual for people to be abandoned at hospitals, but something about the dispatcher's tone sent a shiver up her spine. She made her way down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. When she arrived at the front desk, the scene was eerily unsettling. An old woman sat in a wheelchair, staring blankly at the tiled floor. Her silver hair was neatly combed, but slightly disheveled, as if someone had taken care to make her presentable, just enough to avoid suspicion. The security guard on duty shifted uncomfortably. Her car pulled up outside. The driver left her here and sped off before we could stop him. No name, no ID, just left her. Susan's chest tightened. How could someone do this? She crouched down, studying the woman's face. There was something haunting about her emptiness, like someone who had been waiting a long time for something, only to forget what it was. "Mom," Susan said gently, "can you tell me your name?" The woman didn't answer. Susan sighed, reaching for the thin medical file placed beside her. It contained only the basics, general health notes, a brief history. Then her eyes landed on the name, Beatrice Lewis. It meant nothing to Susan, no immediate recognition. But then, as she looked closer, something caught her attention. Pinned. To the woman's coat was an old brooch, golden with a delicate engraving of a bird in flight. A strange, sinking feeling washed over Susan. She had seen this brooch before. It was the same. One her mother wore in the only photograph she had of her. The mother she had been told died when she was a baby. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be possible? Susan's fingers trembled as they brushed against the brooch. It was identical. Every curve, every detail matched the one she had seen so many times in that old, faded photograph of her mother. But that was impossible. Her mother was gone. Her pulse quickened. Pushing aside the rush of emotions, she focused on the elderly woman before her. "Beatrice Lewis," she murmured, testing the name on her tongue. No reaction. The woman's vacant gaze remained fixed on some distant place only she could see. The security guard cleared his throat. "Look, I know this is unsettling, but we have to process her." Intake. "Social services might take days to track down next of kin." Susan barely heard him. Her mind raced. She had to be imagining things. The brooch could be a coincidence. But then, why did she feel like the ground beneath her was shifting? With an effort, she straightened her shoulders. "I'll take her to an exam room, see if I can learn more." Carefully, she wheeled Beatrice down the corridor, away from the cold sterility of the hospital entrance. The woman remained silent, her hands resting limply in her lap. But as they moved through the hallways, Susan noticed something, a slight twitch of Beatrice's fingers, as if the place, or something within it, was stirring something deep inside her. Once inside a private room, Susan knelt beside the wheelchair and took Beatrice's hand gently. Her skin was thin as paper, fragile like something that could crumble with the slightest pressure. "Beatrice, can you hear me?" The woman's lips parted slightly. A breath, almost a whisper, but no words. Susan sighed. Alzheimer's, perhaps. Dementia. It wasn't unusual for abandoned elderly patients to be battling memory loss. She reached for the file again, flipping through its sparse contents, medical evaluations, scattered notations. Then her heart skipped. A handwritten entry near the bottom patient exhibits episodes of crying when hearing the name Susan. The room suddenly felt too small. Her vision blurred as she read the words again, the weight of it pressed against her chest. No, this couldn't be real. Her own name, linked to this woman, linked to Beatrice. And just like that, something inside her whispered a terrifying possibility. What if everything she had been told about her past was a lie? Susan couldn't shake the weight of those words. Patient exhibits episodes of crying when hearing the name Susan. They played over and over in her mind, growing louder with each repetition. She sat in the dimly lit nurse's station, Beatrice's file open in front of her. The pages felt thin beneath her fingertips, fragile like the history they held had been waiting too long to be uncovered. Something wasn't right. The information was sparse, too sparse for a woman who had supposedly lived decades under medical care. Dates were missing, doctors' notes were vague, no mention of family, no emergency contacts, just a cold clinical record of symptoms, memory loss, confusion, occasional distress. But Susan had worked in hospitals long enough to know when a file had been scrubbed, someone had erased parts of Beatrice's life. Her heart pounded. Why? She traced a finger along the documents, searching for something, anything, that might explain who this woman truly was. And then, near the bottom of the pile, she found something odd, a transfer form. It was old, yellowed with age, barely clinging to the folder. Beatrice had been moved between facilities several times. Most of them were standard hospitals, but one name stood out: Crestwood Psychiatric Institute. Susan's breath hitched. Crestwood had been shut down years ago after allegations of abuse and mistreatment. Patients were often sent there not because they needed help, but because someone wanted them forgotten. Her stomach twisted. Beatrice had been there. Why? A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're up late." Susan snapped the file shut, looking up to see Margaret, one of the senior nurses standing by the doorway. Her expression was unreadable. "Just going through patient history," Susan said, trying to sound casual. Margaret sighed, stepping closer. "You found her file, didn't you?" Susan's throat went dry. "You know something." Margaret hesitated, then lowered her voice. "If you know what's good for you, you'll stop looking." Susan felt a chill crawl down her spine. "What happened to her?" she asked, gripping the file tighter. Margaret shook her head. "Some stories don't want to be uncovered." But Susan wasn't going to stop. She had to know the truth, even if it led her somewhere she wasn't ready to go. Susan couldn't sleep. The words Margaret had said, "Some stories don't want to be uncovered," clung to her like a warning. But it was too late. She was already in too deep. The next morning, as soon as her shift ended, she made a decision. She needed to know what happened at Crestwood. Hospitals kept old patient records archived, but psychiatric institutions were different. Many of them, especially ones like Crestwood, had a history of covering things up. Still, Susan had a plan. She had been in the system long enough to know the right people to ask, the right files to request, without raising suspicion. An hour later, she sat in the hospital's records department, staring at a stack of brittle, faded documents. She flipped through them carefully, scanning each page. Then she found it. Beatrice Lewis, admitted in 1961. Diagnosis: postpartum psychosis. Susan's hands shook. Her eyes darted to the next page. Doctor's notes, written in slanted handwriting. Patient insists she was forced to give up her daughter. Exhibits signs of extreme emotional distress. Repeatedly calls for an infant named Susan. Susan's breath caught in her throat. She was talking about me. She forced herself to keep reading. Patient claims her father arranged the adoption against her will. Claims she was not given a choice. Uncooperative. Unstable. The words blurred. As tears welled in Susan's eyes. All these years she had believed her mother had died. That was what she had been told. That was the story everyone had accepted. But the truth was far worse. Beatrice had been silenced. Her own family had put her away, locked her inside a place designed to make her disappear. Her crime: refusing to give up her baby. Susan clenched her jaw, rage boiling inside her. Beatrice wasn't sick, she wasn't dangerous. She had been a mother fighting for her child, and they had stolen everything from her. She turned to the last page in the final recorded note from Crestwood before it shut down. Patient's condition has deteriorated. No longer recognizes names or faces. She has forgotten the child she once cried for. A sob escaped Susan's lips. They had taken her baby, and then time had taken her memory. She looked down at her own, hands pale and trembling. Her mother had forgotten her, but Susan would never forget, and now she would do whatever it took to bring her back. Susan sat in the empty break room, staring at the medical file spread open before her. The fluorescent light overhead flickered slightly, casting shadows across the pages. Her mind raced. Her heart pounded, but one thought screamed louder than the rest. They took everything from her. Beatrice had never abandoned her. She had been taken, locked away, and erased from existence. Susan's hands clenched into fists. She looked over at the security footage from the night Beatrice was dropped off. A grainy black and white image showed a dark sedan pulling up outside the hospital. A man in a long coat stepped out, wheeled Beatrice to the entrance, and then disappeared into the night. Who was he? And why, after all these years, had Beatrice been abandoned here, at this hospital? The pieces didn't fit. A sudden wave of nausea hit her. Was this a cruel coincidence, or had someone wanted her to find Beatrice? A voice startled her from the doorway. "You're still looking into her, aren't you?" Susan turned to see Margaret, the senior nurse, watching her with a weary expression. Susan didn't bother denying it. "You knew something about her." Margaret hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I didn't think. It was my place to say anything, but I remember her from years ago." Susan's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Margaret sighed. "I was a young nurse when Beatrice was first admitted. She wasn't always like this. She could talk, remember things. She was fragile, but she still had hope." Susan swallowed hard. "What happened?" Margaret hesitated, then spoke carefully. "A man used to visit her, not often, just enough to remind her that she wasn't free. I don't know his name, but I remember his face. Stern, like he was carrying some family secret he didn't want anyone to know." Susan's blood ran cold. "My grandfather." Margaret nodded slowly. The walls felt like they were closing in. Her own grandfather had locked her mother away. He had made sure Beatrice would never find her. And now, after all these years, someone had decided to dispose of her, like she was. An old burden finally too heavy to carry. Tears burned at Susan's eyes. "They stole her life," she whispered. Margaret placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But you found her." Susan wiped her face and took a shaky breath. Beatrice had lost everything. Her daughter, her freedom, her memories. But there was one thing Susan could still give her. She wouldn't let her mother die alone. Susan stood outside Beatrice's hospital room, gripping the medical file tightly in her hands. The weight of everything she had uncovered pressed against her chest. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She had been torn away, silenced, locked away, like a secret too shameful to exist. Now, after decades of separation, they were in the same room again. But did Beatrice even know? Taking a deep breath, Susan stepped inside. Beatrice sat propped up in bed, staring at the wall with that same distant, empty expression. The thin hospital blanket covered her frail body, and her hands rested motionless on her lap. But there it was, the brooch still pinned to her hospital gown, the same brooch from the photograph. The only connection Susan had ever had to her mother. Her throat tightened. She pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "Beatrice," she said softly. "It's me, Susan." No reaction. Susan hesitated, then reached out and gently touched the brooch. "I recognize this," she whispered. "You used to wear it all the time." A flicker. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Susan saw it, a tiny movement in Beatrice's fingers, as if her body remembered something her mind couldn't. Susan's pulse quickened. "You held me once," she continued, her voice shaking. "A long time ago. You fought for me." Beatrice's lips parted slightly, her breath hitching Encouraged, Susan leaned closer. "Do you remember me?" she whispered. "Mom." For a long moment there was silence. Then, so soft, so fragile, Beatrice spoke. "Susan." It was barely a whisper. A single word, cracked and uncertain but real. Tears blurred Susan's vision. Beatrice's cloudy eyes locked onto hers, and in them, just for a fleeting second, there was something more. Recognition. A mother who had been lost to time, stolen, by those who wanted her forgotten, was still there. Susan clutched her hand tightly. "I'm here," she choked out. "I found you." And this time, she wouldn't let go. Susan didn't move. She barely breathed. The room around her, the beeping monitors, the distant murmur of hospital staff faded into nothing. The only thing that mattered was the frail woman in front of her, her mother. Beatrice's lips trembled, her eyes unfocused, lost somewhere between the past and present. But she had said it. Susan, the name she had once cried for, the name she had been forced to forget. Tears blurred Susan's vision, but she refused to look away. She squeezed Beatrice's hand, careful not to startle her, afraid that if she let go, the moment would slip through her fingers. "I'm here, Mom," she whispered. "I found you." Beatrice blinked slowly. Her breath was shallow, her body weak, but something in her face shifted, a flicker of awareness. For a long moment there was only silence. Then Beatrice's fingers twitched. Her hand, frail and cold, curled slightly around Susan's. It wasn't much, but it was real. A sob caught in Susan's throat. She had prepared herself for disappointment, for the possibility that Beatrice would never know who she was. But this was hope. Beatrice swallowed, her throat dry. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "You look like her." Susan's breath hitched. "Like who?" she asked softly. Beatrice's gaze drifted, unfocused, like she was chasing a memory just out of reach. "The baby," she murmured. Susan's heart clenched. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, the only one she had of her mother. A young woman, smiling, holding a newborn in her arms. She placed it gently in Beatrice's lap. Beatrice stared at it, her frail body motionless. Seconds passed. Then, her fingers, unsteady, trembling, slowly traced the image. Something shifted in her expression. A deep crease formed between her brows. Her breath hitched, and then a tear rolled down her cheek. Susan let out a shaky breath. "Do you remember?" she whispered. Beatrice's lips parted, her eyes, once so distant, locked onto Susan's, and in a voice so weak, so fragile, yet filled with something deep and unshakable, she whispered, "My baby." The dam inside Susan broke. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her mother's hand tighter. "I'm here," she sobbed. "I was always here." Beatrice exhaled shakily. Her lips curled into the smallest, faintest smile. A name stolen by time. A mother forgotten by the world. But in this moment they had found each other again. Susan sat by Beatrice's bedside, their hands still clasped together. The quiet hum of the hospital surrounded them, but inside Susan there was only the sound of her own heart pounding. For so long she had believed she was alone in the world, that her mother was nothing more than a distant, unreachable past. But now, here she was, alive, holding her hand, speaking her name. Tears still clung to the corners of Beatrice's eyes, her fragile body shaking from exhaustion. But there was something else in her now, something that hadn't been there before. Recognition, a mother's love, buried under decades of loss, still alive beneath the surface. Susan wiped her face with the back of her hand, then spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. "They told me you died." Beatrice blinked slowly, her expression tightening. "They took you," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. "I didn't want to let go." Susan's throat tightened. "I know," she said. "I know now." She had spent years searching for something, belonging, family, answers to questions she never dared to ask. And now, all of it had led her here, to her mother. But the fight wasn't over. Beatrice had been discarded, abandoned like an unwanted burden. Someone had brought her here to Susan's hospital. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew, and Susan would find out who. She looked at Beatrice with new resolve. "You're safe now," she promised. "I won't let anyone take you away again." Beatrice let out a slow, shuddering breath. Her fingers curled just slightly around Susan's. For the first time in decades, she wasn't alone. Weeks later, Susan sat across from a lawyer's desk, documents spread out before her. Beatrice's story wasn't going to be buried. With the help of hospital records, Susan had uncovered the truth. Her grandfather's influence, the forced institutionalization, the decades of neglect. She had filed to become Beatrice's legal guardian. No more hospitals that treated her like a nameless patient. No more silence, and most importantly, no more being forgotten. As she helped her mother into a warm coat ready to take her home, Beatrice turned to her. Her face, though aged and tired, held something new. "Peace. I found you, Mom," Susan whispered. Beatrice smiled softly, reaching up to touch the brooch still pinned to her chest. "I never forgot you, my daughter." Susan swallowed the lump in her throat. They had lost a lifetime. They could never get it back, but in the end love had found its way home, and that was all that mattered. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every story we share is a reminder that love, resilience, and second chances can change lives. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Thank you for watching. And remember, some stories deserve to be told.